What if I told you that while Robert E. Lee became one of the most famous names of the Civil War, his own children lived lives that were complex, often tragic, and today are almost forgotten? Behind the uniform of the Confederate general stood a father whose 7 children would each navigate the stormy aftermath of the war in their own way. Some fought, some lost, some struggled to preserve their legacy, while others quietly faded into history. Robert E. Lee and his wife, Mary Anna Custis Lee, raised 4 daughters and 3 sons. Their children grew up surrounded by privilege, the Custis inheritance, linking them to George Washington's stepfamily, and the Lee name tying them to one of Virginia's oldest dynasties. But the Civil War changed everything. When the Confederacy fell, the Lees lost not only their cause, but also their home, Arlington, which became the grounds of what is now Arlington National Cemetery. From that moment forward, each child's life was shaped by the shadow of their father's legacy and the collapse of the world they once knew. The eldest son, George Washington Custis Lee, was born on September 16, 1832. At Arlington House, the grand Custis family estate that overlooked the Potomac River and the city of Washington. As the eldest son of Robert E. Lee and Mary Anna Custis Lee, he carried 2 powerful legacies: the Custis name, which linked him to George Washington through his maternal line, and the Lee name, already respected throughout Virginia. Expectations for him were high from the beginning. From a young age, Custis, known within the family simply as Boo, was serious, disciplined, and intelligent. Like his father before him, he attended the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he quickly distinguished himself. In 1854, he graduated first in his class, a mark of brilliance that cemented the belief that he might equal or even surpass his father's accomplishments. Before the Civil War, Custis served in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, designing fortifications and overseeing construction projects. His skill was admired, but when the secession crisis erupted in 1861, he faced the same painful decision as his father. Would he remain loyal to the United States, or would he follow Virginia into the Confederacy? Like Robert E. Lee, Custis resigned his U.S. commission and cast his lot with the South during the Civil War. His role differed from his father's, while Robert commanded the Army of Northern Virginia. Custis worked closely with Confederate President Jefferson Davis, serving as his aide-de-camp. This meant he was more often behind a desk than on the battlefield, dealing with correspondence, planning, and military strategy at the highest levels of government. His loyalty to Davis earned him a reputation as a capable administrator, though some criticized him for not seeking active combat. By 1864, he was promoted to Major General, but the war's end was already in sight. In April 1865, as the Confederacy collapsed, Custis Lee was among those captured in the evacuation of Richmond. Like many Confederate officers, he was eventually paroled, but what awaited him after the war was not just defeat, it was dispossession. The family's home, Arlington House, had been seized by Union forces during the war. In 1864, it was sold at a government auction after his mother failed to pay property taxes in person, something she could not do because she was trapped behind Confederate lines. Soon, the estate was filled with the graves of Union soldiers, transforming the Lee home into what would become Arlington National Cemetery. For years, Custis Lee carried the bitterness of that loss. He lived a relatively quiet life, teaching engineering at Virginia Military Institute and later becoming president of Washington and Lee University, the very institution his father had led until his death in 1870. But his defining post-war act came in 1877, when he filed a lawsuit against the United States government, demanding the return of Arlington House. The legal battle lasted years, climbing all the way to the Supreme Court in 1882. In a stunning decision, the court ruled in his favor. The property had indeed been taken unlawfully. Custis Lee was declared the rightful heir. But here is where the story takes a remarkable turn. By then, Arlington was no longer just a house, it had become sacred ground, a cemetery for thousands of fallen soldiers. Reclaiming it was impossible. Instead, Custis accepted financial compensation of $150,000, a vast sum at the time, but far less than the symbolic weight of the home he had lost. In this way, Robert E. Lee's eldest son succeeded in forcing the United States to recognize the injustice, but he also closed the door on ever reclaiming the family seat. The rest of Custis Lee's life was quiet. He never married, never had children, and rarely sought the spotlight. For decades, he lived in Lexington, Virginia, where he taught, studied, and remained a somewhat aloof but respected figure. He carried the dignity of the Lee name, but always in the shadow of his father, when he died in 1913 at the age of 80. He was buried beside his parents in the Lee Chapel at Washington and Lee University. His death closed a chapter not only on his own life, but also on the hopes once placed on him as the heir to the Lee legacy. The story of Custis Lee is one of brilliance, duty, and loss. He was the son who seemed destined to carry the Lee name into the future with honor, but the Civil War left him without a home, without descendants, and without the glory that had once seemed certain. Instead, his greatest legacy became a courtroom victory that reshaped the history of Arlington, turning personal loss into a national memorial. The second son, William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, was born on May 31, 1837, at Arlington House. The second, son of Robert E. Lee and Mary Anna Custis Lee, from an early age. He seemed to inherit much of his father's love of the land, the outdoors, and most of Olhorse. His family called him Rooney, and while his older brother Custis leaned toward books and discipline, Rooney embraced action, energy, and the life of a cavalryman. Before the Civil War, Rooney attended Harvard University, one of the few Lee children to leave Virginia for education. After graduation, he joined the U.S. Army and served briefly before resigning his commission to take up farming on the Custis family estates. But when war broke out in 1861, Rooney, like his father, could not remain neutral. He joined the Confederate cavalry, quickly proving himself under the leadership of Jeb Stuart. As a cavalry officer, Rooney earned a reputation for bravery and skill. He fought in several major campaigns, including the Peninsula Campaign and the 7 Days Battles. At the Battle of Brandy Station in 1863, the largest cavalry battle of the war, Rooney's command was heavily engaged. During this period, however, his life took a devastating personal turn. His home, the White House plantation in Virginia, was burned by Union troops. His wife, Charlotte Wickham, was forced to flee with their 2 young children, only to die suddenly of typhoid fever not long afterward. Rooney, grieving the loss of his wife, was himself severely wounded in June 1863 and captured while recovering. He spent nearly a year as a prisoner of war, confined at Fort Monroe. When he was finally exchanged in 1864, he returned to the Confederate Army and was promoted to Major General. But the Confederacy's days were numbered, and by 1865, Rooney, like his father, surrendered. After the war, Rooney returned to farming in Virginia, determined to rebuild the land and his life. Unlike his brothers, Rooney remarried, wedding Mary Tabb Bowling, a descendant of Pocahontas, with whom he had several children. He worked to restore his estate, Ravensworth, and gradually became active in politics. In 1875, he was elected to the Virginia State Senate, and later, in 1886, he entered the U.S. House of Representatives, serving 2 terms as a congressman. The symbolism was striking. The son of the Confederacy's most famous general, now serving in the legislature of the nation, his father had once fought against Rooney. Lee's life ended in 1891 at the age of 54. He was buried at the Lee Chapel in Lexington, Virginia, alongside his father and brothers. Unlike most of Robert E. Lee's children, Rooney left behind descendants through his second marriage, ensuring that at least one branch of the family line continued. The youngest son, Robert Edward Lee Jr., the youngest son, was born on October 27, 1843, at Arlington House. Unlike his older brothers, who carried heavy expectations, Robert Jr. grew up with a lighter, more easygoing personality. His family affectionately called him Rob, and his life reflected a quieter temperament compared to the brilliance of Custis or the battlefield daring of Rooney. When the Civil War began, Rob was only 18 years old. Like his brothers, he joined the Confederate Army, serving as a private in the Rockbridge Artillery before later transferring to the cavalry. While he performed his duty faithfully, Rob never sought military glory. His service was steady, but not distinguished by rank or high command. To those who knew him, he seemed more comfortable with the land and a simple life than with the ambition of politics or the burden of leadership. After the war, Rob returned to Virginia, choosing the life of a farmer rather than following his brothers into public service. For a time, he managed land at Powhatan County and later near Petersburg. But farming, after the devastation of the Civil War, was grueling, often yielding more hardship than success. Still, Rob persevered, living modestly and quietly. In later years, Rob turned to writing. His memoir, Recollections, and Letters of General Robert E. Lee, published in 1904, became an invaluable resource for historians. Through his words, we see glimpses of the general as a father, stern, reserved, yet affectionate. Rob's writing preserved a side of Robert E. Lee that history books often overlook, a man concerned not only with the fate of armies, but with the well-being of his children, his home, and his faith. Unlike his brothers, Rob never entered politics, never married, and never had children. His devotion remained largely to memory of his father, of Arlington, and of the vanished world of his youth. When he died in 1914 at the age of 71, he was buried at the Lee Chapel in Lexington, Virginia, near his parents and siblings. By then, the Civil War was half a century past, but Rob remained a living link to it until the very end. The Lee daughters lived lives marked by sacrifice and loss. Mary Custis Lee, the eldest daughter, was born on July 12, 1835, intelligent, independent, and strong-willed. Mary was in many ways the most modern of the Lee children. She never married, and some suggested this was because the war had destroyed her social circle and prospects. Others believed Mary had no interest in surrendering her independence, especially under the weight of her father's legacy. After the Civil War, Mary lived abroad for extended periods, traveling through Europe and the Middle East. Unlike her siblings, who remained tied to Virginia, she sought the wider world. Her name returned to public attention in 1910 when she was arrested in Alexandria, Virginia, for refusing to leave the white Sonali section of a streetcar. It was a bold act in the age of Jim Crow. Some contemporaries saw it as defiance, while others described it as Mary's stubborn nature, regardless of intent. Her stand placed her in the rare position of confronting racial segregation laws head-on. Mary Custis Lee lived longer than any of her siblings. Dying in 1918 at the age of 82, she was buried in the family crypt at Lee Chapel. Her life, stretching from the grandeur of Arlington to the era of segregation and global travel, reflected both the privileges and the burdens of being Robert E. Lee's daughter. Anne Carter Lee was born on June 18, 1839, the second daughter of Robert and Mary Lee. Among all the children, Anne was often said to be her father's favorite, known for her quiet gentleness, kindness, and devout faith. She was a source of comfort to her family, especially during the turbulent years before the war, when the Civil War broke out. Anne remained at home with her mother and sisters while her father and brothers went to the front. But in 1862, tragedy struck. While staying with relatives in North Carolina, Anne contracted typhoid fever, a disease that spread rapidly during the war years due to poor sanitation. At just 23 years old, she died, leaving her family devastated. Robert E. Lee, who was already carrying the burdens of command, was shaken by her loss. In letters, he spoke of it as too precious to lose, a grief that would remain with him for the rest of his life. Anne was buried in North Carolina, and unlike most of her siblings, she never saw the end of the war. Her early death became a symbol of how even the most sheltered families could not escape the war's toll. Eleanor Agnes Lee, called Agnes, was born on February 27, 1841. She was the third daughter, and after Anne's death, Agnes took on the role of quiet companion to her father, known for her piety and reserved nature. She was deeply religious and dedicated much of her life to the church. After the war, when Robert E. Lee accepted the presidency of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, Agnes moved there with him and became one of his closest confidants. She was often by his side, managing household matters and providing emotional support during his difficult post-war years. To many who knew her, Agnes seemed to carry the weight of the family's sorrow on her shoulders, but tragedy followed her as well. In 1873, just 3 years after her father's death, Agnes fell ill with tuberculosis. Despite medical treatment, her health declined rapidly, and she died at the age of 32. Her passing was another painful loss for a family that had already endured so much. Today, her grave lies beside her father's in the crypt of the Lee Chapel at Washington and Lee University, where she rests among her family members. Mildred Child Lee, the youngest daughter, was born on February 10, 1846. Lively, cheerful, and affectionate, she was her father's favorite child in his later years. He called her Precious Life, a nickname that reflected the warmth she brought to the family. Unlike her older sisters, who were known for their seriousness, Mildred's spirit and charm made her stand out. After the war, Mildred, like her sisters, never married. She remained deeply devoted to her parents, especially her mother, after her father's death. Mildred moved often, living with relatives and friends, but she always worked to preserve the family's memory and legacy. In many ways, she became the caretaker of her father's image, ensuring that Robert E. Lee was remembered with reverence in the decades after the war. Her later years were quieter, but not without hardship. As the last surviving Lee daughter, she carried the heavy responsibility of being one of the final living connections to her famous father. She died in 1905 at the age of 59 and was buried in the Lee Chapel, where she rests alongside her parents and siblings. Together, the lives of Agnes and Mildred reflect the profound impact of the Civil War on the daughters of Robert E. Lee. None of them married, none had children, and their stories were often overshadowed by their fathers' fame. Yet their devotion, sacrifice, and untimely deaths shaped the family's legacy just as much as their brothers. Public roles. Now we have walked through the lives of all 7 children of Robert E. Lee: Custis, Rooney, Robert Jr., Mary Ann, Agnes, and Mildred. Their stories marked by brilliance, tragedy, devotion, and silence remind us that history's great figures are never just generals or politicians. They are fathers and mothers, sons and daughters whose families must live with the consequences of their choices.